My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 32 years old. And last Christmas, I walked into my parents' house in Newton, thinking it would be just another holiday dinner. The table was set with turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. Relatives laughing while the tree lights sparkled in the corner. For a moment, it felt like maybe I could belong, but as the glasses were raised for a toast, my parents turned to me, their voices sharp enough to cut through the music, and said I was the biggest disgrace to this family. Forks stopped midair. My cousins froze, and the room went silent as someone's phone started recording. That night didn't just shatter Christmas. It set in motion something none of them could have imagined. Keep watching, because by the end of this story, you'll see how the daughter they tried to erase became the one name they could never ignore. So let me take you back to that night in Newton, when the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the house, and I sat at the long dining table in my parents' home. It was Christmas night, 2023, and the Mitchell family had gathered like we did every year. A glowing tree stood in the corner of the living room, its lights blinking in soft rhythm. Gifts, wrapped in red and gold, stacked neatly beneath it. The table was crowded with dishes of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, and baskets of warm bread. Laughter bounced off the walls as cousins joked. Aunts passed plates, and my mother floated from guest to guest with a polished smile. I sat at the far side of the table, a glass of red wine in my hand, trying to blend into the cheer. My older brother Mark sat near the head of the table next to Dad, his wife Claire by his side. Dad, Richard Mitchell, looked sharp in his navy sweater, silver hair combed back, and a confidence that seemed to radiate even here, far from the boardroom. Mom, Elaine, wore her favorite emerald green dress, pearls at her neck, her posture as perfect as always. For a brief moment, I let myself feel something almost like comfort. The candlelight flickered. Music played softly from the speakers. And even though I often felt like a guest rather than a daughter in this house, I wanted to believe tonight could be different. Dad raised his glass, clearing his throat to call for attention. The room quieted as he looked around the table. His voice was steady as he thanked everyone for coming, for celebrating together as a family, for another year of blessings. He nodded to Mark, praising his accomplishments at the law firm, how proud he was of his eldest son's leadership and dedication. Mark smiled politely, his hand brushing Claire's, as if to share the moment. I felt the familiar pang, the quiet knowledge that I would not be mentioned. Still, I kept my expression neutral, swirling the wine in my glass. Then Dad's eyes slid to me. For a second, I thought maybe something had shifted, that this year he might soften. But instead, his jaw tightened, and Mom's gaze joined his, both of them turning toward me. You are the biggest disgrace to this family. The words were sharp, unrelenting, spoken with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. It was as if the room stopped breathing. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses hovered in the air. A cousin glanced from me to Dad. Wide-eyed, my aunt's smile faltered, and she set her napkin down. The holiday cheer evaporated, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. I felt my cheeks flush, my grip tightening around the stem of the glass. Shame surged first, hot and overwhelming. Before anger pushed its way to the surface, Mark's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Claire touched his arm as if to keep him still. I forced myself to breathe, the quiet thrum of my heartbeat filling my ears. My parents' eyes stayed locked on me, unwavering, as if they wanted me to shrink right there at the table, to accept their verdict in front of everyone. I rose slowly from my chair, the legs scraping against the hardwood. My hand was steady as I set my glass of wine back down on the table. My voice came out clear, stronger than I expected, cutting through the thick silence. Then erase me from everything, your dinners, your plans, even your will. If I am such a disgrace, let me be gone completely. A collective gasp rippled down the table. Someone dropped a fork, The fire crackled in the living room, the only sound daring to move. Dad's face stiffened, his mouth opening as if to respond. But no words came. Mom's lips parted slightly, her hand pressed against the tablecloth. I looked around at the faces staring back at me, cousins with pity in their eyes, uncles shifting uncomfortably, Aunt Carol's gaze filled with quiet concern. The children had gone still, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand the words. I could see the reflection of the tree's lights in the wide eyes of my younger cousins. They were supposed to be enjoying dessert, waiting for the gift exchange. Instead, they watched me, the black sheep, rise against the family order. Their parents tugged them closer, whispering for them to sit properly. The smell of cloves and sugar should have been comforting. But now it turned my stomach. Mi chest felt tight. I remembered every holiday before this one. Every year, when my work was brushed aside, when my gifts were smiled at politely but forgotten as soon as the wrapping hit the floor. I remembered my father's disappointed glances, my mother's forced smiles, Mark's steady spotlight. And here, on the night when families were supposed to embrace each other, the final blow had been delivered. I straightened my back, refusing to let them see me falter. My voice had been calm, but inside I was trembling. Not from weakness, but from fury. My entire life had led to this table. This moment of public humiliation dressed as a family dinner. I pushed my chair back fully and stood tall. The room heavy, with everything unsaid, without another word. I turned toward the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the floor, each step carrying me further from the glow of the dining room and deeper into the chill waiting outside. The cold air rushed at me the second I opened the front door. Snowflakes floated down from the black sky, landing on my bare arms. Behind me, the muffled sounds of voices erupted, some sharp, some pleading. But I didn't stop to separate them. I stepped out onto the porch, the wreath on the door brushing my shoulder as I closed it firmly behind me. The night was silent, except for the crunch of my boots on the thin layer of snow covering the driveway. Houses up and down the street glowed with Christmas lights, colors blinking, yards decorated with inflatable Santas and reindeer. To the rest of the neighborhood, it was a perfect holiday scene. To me, it felt like I had just walked out of a courtroom where a sentence had been passed. My breath came out in white clouds, quick and shallow, but I forced myself to slow down. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but beneath it, I felt something steadier, colder. Resolve. They had finally said out loud what I had always known they believed, and I had finally answered. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses from another house drifting faintly across the street. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I glanced down at the screen. Mark's name, then Mom's, then an aunt. I let it go dark in my hand. I lifted my head and looked back at the house one last time, its windows glowing with warmth that no longer belonged to me. Then I turned away, pulling my coat tighter around me, and started walking down the street through the falling snow. Snowflakes stung my cheeks as I walked down the street, my boots crunching against the thin layer of ice on the sidewalk. The farther I went, the dimmer the glow of my parents' house became behind me, until it was swallowed by the night, and all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps. With each step, the memory of what had just happened sank deeper into me. It wasn't new. Not really. It was simply the first time the words had been spoken aloud with such brutality. They had always thought of me as a disappointment. Tonight they had just stripped away the last veil of politeness. I tucked my chin into my scarf, the cold biting at my skin, and let the past creep in the way. It always did after moments like this. I thought of myself at 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my bedroom, sketching flowers I had picked from the garden into a worn notebook. While other kids played tag in the yard, I was lost in the swirl of colors I imagined in my head. I had filled drawer after drawer with drawings, some rough and crooked, some surprisingly good for a child. But none of it ever mattered to Dad. He would peek into my room, shake his head, and say I should be outside with Mark learning how to be competitive, how to win. Mark was everything I was not. He was confident, athletic, already a leader before he even reached middle school. He joined the soccer team, played Little League, and always came home with trophies that ended up on shelves in the living room. When relatives visited, Mom would gesture proudly to Mark's medals as if they were proof of the family's worth. My drawings, taped to the side of the fridge, were quietly removed after a week, replaced by report cards or photographs of Mark's latest game. At 10, I begged for an easel for Christmas. I wanted something to paint on, something that made me feel like my passion mattered. That year, Mark got a brand new mountain bike with thick tires and shiny red paint. Everyone crowded around him in the living room as he circled the tree, his face glowing as he ran his hands over the handlebars. I remember clapping along, trying to smile, but my eyes kept drifting back to my own gift, a small cardboard box set to the side. Inside was a beginner's art kit. I had torn the paper off with genuine excitement, but the look on Dad's face as I held up the paints made my heart sink. He let out a laugh and said it wasn't practical, that I'd play with it for a few weeks and then forget. He patted my shoulder like he was humoring me. Mom gave a faint smile but quickly turned her attention back to Mark, who was already riding his bike around the driveway, cousins cheering as he spun circles in the snow. That kit became my world for months. I painted until the brushes frayed and the colors ran dry. I stayed up late trying to capture the sunset from my window, tried to paint portraits of my friends from school. I would carry my finished work downstairs, hoping someone would notice. Sometimes Aunt Carol would pause and ask me about it, her voice warm and encouraging. But my parents always brushed past, telling me not to get paint on the carpet, asking if I had finished my homework, reminding me that Mark had practice in the morning. By the time I was 12, the pattern was clear. Mark was the golden child. I was the dreamer who needed to grow out of it. I started to keep my sketchbooks hidden, storing them under the bed or inside my closet. Not because I was ashamed of what I created, but because I was tired of the sighs and dismissive glances. At 14, when Mark was chosen captain of the debate team, Dad threw a party in his honor. The living room was filled with neighbors and family friends, everyone raising glasses to celebrate his achievement. I had just finished a painting of the city skyline at dusk, a piece I was proud of. I brought it down, hoping maybe this time it would be different. But when I showed Dad, he took the canvas in his hands for a brief second, nodded, and set it down on a chair without another word. The painting sat there all evening, ignored, while the party went on. Later I found it leaning against the coat rack, a faint boot print across the corner. The older I got, the more the comparisons cut. Teachers called my parents to rave about Mark's leadership. Mine called to warn that I was distracted, always sketching in the margins of my notebooks. Mom would look at me across the dinner table and ask when I was going to focus on something that mattered. Dad would remind me that dreams didn't pay bills. Every word chipped away at me until I began to believe them. I can still see one Christmas when I was 15. The snow outside had piled up high, the smell of ham filling the kitchen. Mark unwrapped a sleek leather briefcase, a gift meant to symbolize the future he already seemed destined for. My present was another art set, nicer than the first, but handed to me with a joke from Dad about how maybe someday I could design ads for Mark's law firm. Everyone laughed lightly, not realizing how much it stung. I smiled on the outside, but inside, I felt myself folding smaller and smaller. Even in school, the labels followed me. Mark was introduced as the Mitchell boy, with a bright future. I was the girl who liked to draw. When college brochures came in the mail, Dad stacked them in 2 piles. For Mark, Harvard and Yale. For me, the State University's business program. When I dared suggest studying graphic design, he dismissed it instantly, saying I was not going to waste tuition on finger paints. I learned then that no matter how much I created, no matter how passionately I worked, to them, it was always going to be a hobby, never a career, and the word hobby felt like a sentence, a constant reminder that in their eyes, I had no real place at the table. As I walked that snowy street on Christmas night, the memory of those years returned in painful flashes. Every Christmas gift that reminded me I was less, every laugh that told me I did not belong, every look that said I was the outsider in my own family. The snow gathered on my lashes, and I brushed it away, my breath quick in the night air. I remembered how Aunt Carol had always been the only one to pause, to ask me what I was painting, to say quietly that she thought I had real talent. Her encouragement was like a small flame in a storm, something that kept me from giving up completely. Still, the weight of all those years had settled into me like a stone. Dad's words at the dinner table tonight were only the loudest echo of what had been whispered for decades. I had been told who I was long before I was old enough to choose for myself. I stopped walking for a moment, staring down the empty street lined with glowing Christmas lights. My heart felt heavy but steady. The truth was clear. I had been defined as the outsider long ago. Tonight only confirmed it. I pulled my coat tighter around me and kept walking, the crunch of snow beneath my boots blending with the sound of my own breathing. Somewhere deep inside, the hurt coiled tight. But alongside it, something else was stirring. I didn't yet know what form it would take. Only that it was there, waiting for the chance to break free. It was only a few months before that Christmas dinner, when the real crack in our family had split open. Early in the fall of 2023, Dad called for a meeting at the house in Newton. Family meetings were rare in our home. Usually decisions were made by him alone, and the rest of us adjusted. When he asked Mark and me to come to his study one Sunday afternoon, I felt the weight of it before I even walked in the door. The study smelled of leather and old paper. The shelves lined with awards, framed photographs of construction sites, and polished models of buildings Mitchell Construction had raised across Massachusetts. Dad sat behind his mahogany desk, his shoulders squared, his expression set in the way it always was before he delivered something final. Mom hovered by the window with a tray of coffee, her pearls glinting against her sweater, while Mark leaned against the arm of a chair, already looking like he belonged in that room more than I ever had. Dad's voice was calm but commanding as he announced his plan. He was officially retiring as CEO of Mitchell Construction by the end of the year. The board had approved the transition, and Mark would be taking over as the new leader of the company. He spoke about it with pride, as if this was the natural progression of things, like Mark had been groomed for this since birth. I sat still, my hands clasped together in my lap, my heart heavy with a truth I had always known, but had never heard said aloud. Of course, it would be Mark. Of course he would inherit the crown. But then Dad turned his eyes to me. For a brief second, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe he had thought of something for me too. Something that recognized who I was, not who he wanted me to be. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside was a printed outline of a proposed role: Director of Marketing and Communications for Mitchell Construction. A high salary, benefits, stock options. It was, by most standards, an extraordinary offer. But it came with one condition. If I took this position, I would have to leave behind my freelance clients, close my small business, and dedicate myself fully to the company. I felt my throat tighten. Dad spoke as though it were a gift, as if I should be grateful that he was offering me a seat at the table after years of watching from the corner. He called it the chance to contribute to the family legacy. Mom poured the coffee, her movements precise, her smile stiff. Mark glanced at me with what looked like encouragement, though it was hard to tell whether it came from genuine concern or his need to keep the peace. I cleared my throat, my voice quiet but steady. I told them I needed time to think about it, that I valued the independence I had built, that my work meant something to the people I served. I tried to explain that my clients trusted me, that I found fulfillment in the freedom to create without the constraints of corporate branding. Dad's face darkened instantly. Time to think. Lauren, his tone carried both disbelief and anger. He leaned forward, his hands pressing into the desk. This is exactly what you should want. Marketing, creativity, a chance to finally give back to what this family has built. I shook my head slowly. I told him I wasn't sure I could do it, that walking away from everything I had built on my own felt like erasing myself. Mark stepped in gently, his voice calm. Maybe there is a way to structure the role so she could keep some outside projects, he suggested. but Dad cut him off before he could finish. "You have had 12 years to play artist," he snapped, his voice rising in the closed room. 12 years of wasting your potential while your brother has worked to uphold this family name. You have contributed nothing. And now you want more time to think. The word nothing hit like a slap. My chest burned as though I had been branded. Nothing. Years of work dismissed in one word. I pushed back my chair and stood, my knees trembling, but my resolve solidifying. I told him I couldn't accept the role. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mom's cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, her eyes lowered to the floor. Mark stared at his shoes. The peacemaker caught in a battle he couldn't win. Dad's face shifted from shock to rage, his hand slamming down on the desk with a crack that echoed through the room. His voice was low but filled with venom. "You will regret this. Lauren. You will regret turning your back on your family." His words seared into me, heavy with finality. I walked out of the study with my pulse hammering, every step feeling like a door closing behind me. In the hallway, I could hear voices muffled through the closed door, Mark trying to reason with him, Mom whispering something soothing. But the damage had been done. The line had been drawn, and I had chosen to stand on the other side. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the family photos that lined the wall. Mark in his cap and gown at Harvard. Dad shaking hands with city officials at ribbon cuttings. Mom hosting charity galas, her smile radiant under the glow of chandeliers, and me, tucked into the edges of group shots. Never the centerpiece. Never the reason for celebration. That night, I drove back to Boston in silence, the highway stretching ahead of me in a blur of headlights and dark sky. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the sound of Dad's voice replaying again and again. "You will regret this." I did not regret it. Not then. Not ever. What I felt was grief. Yes, and anger, but also a small surge of freedom that scared me as much as it thrilled me. Still, his warning hung over me like a storm cloud, promising a reckoning I couldn't yet see. The night air cut into my skin as I pushed away from the table and walked straight through the dining room toward the front hall. My heels clicked against the polished wood floors, each step sharp in the silence that had swallowed the room. I felt eyes burning into my back, whispers already rising as I pulled on my coat from the rack by the door. The wreath swayed when I opened it, the faint smell of pine brushing past me as I stepped onto the porch. Snowflakes tumbled down, catching in my hair, melting against my cheeks. The warmth and glow of the dining room spilled out behind me, but I could not bring myself to turn around. I walked down the porch steps, the cold seeping quickly through my shoes. My breath skama heavy, visible in the air, my pulse still pounding with fury. A voice called out behind me. "Lighter." Hurried. "Lauren." "Wait." It was Aunt Carol. She came out without her coat, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold before closing the distance between us. She reached me at the edge of the driveway and placed a hand gently on my arm. Her embrace was sudden but warm, pulling me into her shoulder, like I was still a child she was trying to shield. Her voice was low, urgent. "You are not a disgrace. You are simply different from them. That is not shameful, no matter what they say." I let out a shaky laugh, my eyes stinging from more than the cold. Different has always been their word for failure. Carol pulled back, her eyes shining with something between sadness and defiance. "Then let it be mine for strength," she whispered. Behind her, I could see the shadowed shapes of relatives standing in the windows, curtains slightly parted, faces pressed close to the glass. Some were holding up their phones. A cousin stepped onto the porch with a phone already raised, angling it toward me as if my humiliation were entertainment. The thought that this would be captured, replayed, dissected in family chats, made my stomach twist. I turned from them, walking farther into the street, where the street lamps cast halos of light on the falling snow. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Then again, until I finally pulled it out. The group chat labeled Mitchell Family Christmas lit up the screen with a flood of messages. Someone had already shared a video. The thumbnail showed me standing with my glass of wine at the table. Dad's furious expression caught mid-sentence. I tapped it without meaning to, and heard his voice echo out into the night. "You are the biggest disgrace to this family." I flinched, closing it quickly. But the damage was done. The comments scrolled beneath it as cousins and aunts reacted. Some typed awkward emojis. Others said things like, "Oh my God," or "This is going to be talked about for years." The shame burned deeper than the cold. A new notification flashed. Facebook. My heart sank. The video had already jumped from the private family chat to the wider world. My cousin Jenna had posted it, tagging several relatives. The caption read, "Things got wild at Christmas dinner." Underneath, the views were climbing rapidly. I stared at the screen, the glow lighting up my red fingers. My private breaking point was now a spectacle. I could already imagine the whispers tomorrow at the country club, at church, among neighbors who had known the Mitchells for decades. The perfect family image my parents had worked so hard to build was cracking, and I was painted as the fracture. Aunt Carol leaned in, her voice firm despite the shivering. "Let them talk. Let them see. The truth was bound to spill out one day. You have nothing to be ashamed of." I wanted to believe her, but my chest was heavy with humiliation. Headlights swept across the snow as a car turned onto the street, and I felt suddenly exposed, standing there in my black dress, my arms clutched tight around me. Carol tugged at my sleeve gently. "Come back inside. At least for your coat," she urged. I shook my head. "I cannot. Not tonight." We stood in silence for a moment, the snow thickening around us, our breaths forming clouds. Carol finally nodded, her expression soft but resolute. "Then go. But remember, this is not the end of your story." She kissed my cheek quickly and hurried back toward the porch, her steps leaving a trail in the snow. I turned away again, pulling my coat tighter. My phone still buzzing in my hand, more messages flooded in. Friends from high school sending screenshots of the video, their texts filled with disbelief. Some offered comfort, some only curiosity. The humiliation had spread far beyond the walls of my parents' home. By the time I reached the corner of the street, I knew what was happening. This moment, this wound, was no longer mine alone. It was gossip. It was entertainment. It was a story that belonged to everyone who thought they knew the Mitchell family. I stopped under the street lamp, my breath heavy, my hands trembling as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. The shame was still there, pulsing hot under my skin. But beneath it, a sharper realization was forming. If I was going to be the subject of their whispers, then I would not let it be on their terms. For the first time that night, I lifted my head, the snow falling steady against my face, and I let myself imagine what it would mean to stop shrinking. The night was quiet. The only sound, the distant murmur of voices back at the house. But inside me, a new thought had begun to take root. I drove back to Boston in silence, the city lights a blur through the windshield as my wipers pushed away falling snow. My body felt heavy inside the car, as though every word spoken at that dinner table had added another stone to my chest. By the time I pulled into the small parking lot beside my apartment building, the clock on the dashboard read just past midnight. The streets were quiet, the usual holiday bustle already dimmed by the storm. Inside my apartment, the air was cool and still, scented faintly of the pine candle I had burned earlier that week. I dropped my keys onto the counter and sank into the couch without taking off my coat, my black dress creasing beneath me. My phone buzzed endlessly on the coffee table, vibrating against the wood in sharp bursts. Mark's name, then Mom's, then Claire's, then numbers I didn't even recognize. I watched it light up again and again, unable to bring myself to answer. The shame was raw, scraping at me with every ring. My father's words replayed in my head until they drowned out the sound of the radiator clicking on in the corner. The biggest disgrace to this family. The phrase looped, its weight crushing and familiar, but this time it had been public. Undeniable. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to stop the trembling in my hands. Anger rose up to meet the shame, burning hotter than the humiliation. I could still hear the faint laughter from relatives, the shuffle of their phones as they recorded me. Their whispers would spread by morning, if they had not already. I wanted to vanish, and at the same time I wanted to scream. The buzzing on the table grew unbearable. I grabbed the phone and swiped it open. Not to answer, but to escape into something I could control. My email app blinked with new notifications. Against my better judgment, I opened them. The first was from a client I had designed a campaign for 2 years earlier. A nonprofit that provided school supplies to children in low-income neighborhoods. Lauren. I saw the video tonight. Please don't let their words define you. The work you did for us still makes a difference every single day. I blinkte. Reading it again. Another email followed. A restaurant owner I had helped with branding last summer. We are proud to have your designs in our window. Your work speaks louder than anyone's judgment. One by one, more messages arrived. Small businesses, community groups, people who had trusted me when no one else had. My chest loosened slightly as I read, my eyes skimming over the words of encouragement. For the first time all evening, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt seen. I stood and walked to my desk. Pulling my laptop open, the familiar hum of the machine filled the silence, the screen glowing with the projects that had carried me for 12 years. I opened my portfolio folder and scrolled. Logos polished until they shone. Posters for charity events that had raised thousands of dollars. Branding packages that had kept new businesses alive through their first fragile years. I clicked on the file for the Children's Hospital fundraiser. The bold, bright design I had created still made me proud. That campaign alone had brought in hundreds of thousands in donations. Yet in my father's eyes, it was nothing. I moved to another folder, pulling up the rebrand for a small bookstore in Cambridge. The owners had sent me a photo once of their grand opening. The shop crowded with customers beneath the sign I had designed. That bookstore was still running. Thriving even. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting off the framed sketches on the wall. My apartment was filled with them. Paintings I had refused to sell. Pieces that had carried me through lonely nights when I wondered if I should give in. Return home, and let my father mold me into something I was not. Each frame was proof of the path I had chosen. I walked to the wall and traced my fingers along the edge of one painting. The Boston skyline at dusk. I remembered the night I finished it. How the city lights had shimmered against the Charles River. How alive I had felt capturing them on canvas. It was not worthless. None of it was. The buzzing phone broke my thoughts again. This time it was Mark. I let it ring until it stopped. My reflection in the dark window looked back at me. Tired, bruised by the night, but not broken. I whispered into the quiet, my voice trembling but firm. It is time they see my worth. The words lingered in the room, stronger than I expected, pulling me upright. I closed the emails, powered down the laptop, and finally slipped off my coat. The black dress clung to me as I moved through the apartment, but I no longer felt like I was suffocating inside it. I felt ready. I poured a glass of water and sat back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the streets, quieting the world. Inside, I could feel the first flicker of resolve taking shape. The disgrace they had named me would become the foundation I would build from. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the cushion beside me, but I left it untouched. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the day press down until it dissolved into something steadier, something sharper. By morning, the shame would still be there, but so would the fire. A week later, I was at my desk in the apartment, the late morning light filtering through the thin curtains. The snow from Christmas had hardened into gray banks along the sidewalks, and Boston felt quieter than usual. Still shaking off the holidays, my coffee had gone cold beside me, forgotten as I scrolled through emails. The phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me swipe to answer. A man's voice introduced himself. David Nguyen, CEO of Next Wave Tech. He spoke with clarity, the kind of voice that carried both authority and curiosity. He told me he had seen the video. My stomach clenched at first, expecting ridicule, but his tone was different. He said he had looked into my work afterward. He mentioned specific campaigns. Details only someone who had studied my portfolio could know. I sat up straighter, my heart thudding. He said he admired the authenticity in my designs, how they felt alive instead of corporate, how they made small organizations look powerful without losing their soul. He told me Next Wave was preparing for a major push into new markets and needed a complete rebrand. Logo, website, messaging, everything. My pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the desk. I asked him what kind of scope he had in mind, expecting a modest project, maybe a refresh of some materials. Instead, he named a figure that made my breath catch. $250,000 for a 6-month contract. It was more than twice what I usually earned in a year. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. I repeated the number back to him slowly, and he confirmed it without hesitation. He said he wanted someone who could see beyond the surface, someone who wasn't afraid to take risks. He said he had watched me in that viral clip, watched me stand up to my family. And while the world saw drama, he saw conviction. He said he wanted that conviction shaping his company's identity. The apartment seemed suddenly too small, the air too still. I got up and paced to the window, watching a delivery truck back into the lot below. My hand tightened around the phone as I asked him if he was certain he wanted me. Someone who didn't have the size or resources of a large agency. His response was steady. That was exactly why. He didn't want polished noise. He wanted vision. I found myself gripping the edge of the windowsill, trying to steady my voice. I told him I needed to think. He laughed lightly and said, of course, but that he hoped I would not take too long. The market would not wait. He suggested coffee later that week to talk details. I agreed, my words slow but sure. And when the call ended, I stood frozen. The phone still pressed to my ear long after the line had gone silent. The shame from Christmas dinner had chased me into every corner of my days since. But now something else rushed in to meet it. A chance. A door I had not expected. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, my reflection staring back at me, eyes wide. Later that night, I pulled out notebooks, sketching ideas, letting my mind run ahead even though nothing had been signed. I thought about color palettes, about typefaces that would speak to innovation without losing warmth. My hands moved faster than my thoughts, pages filling with lines and notes. For the first time in days, I felt the fog lift. The coffee meeting happened at a small cafe near Kendall Square. David was younger than I had expected. Mid-30s, dressed simply in a gray sweater and jeans. He carried no entourage, no assistant, just a leather notebook under his arm. We shook hands and he ordered tea instead of coffee. He asked me about my process, how I worked with clients, how I balanced creative vision with practical needs. He listened intently as I spoke, his eyes focused, nodding occasionally, asking questions that showed he valued substance over polish. When I admitted that I worked alone most of the time, he didn't flinch. Instead, he asked what kind of team I would build if resources were no issue. By the end of the hour, he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a draft contract, already typed, the figure printed in black and white at the bottom of the page. My pulse pounded as I read it. I looked up at him, my voice lower now, cautious. Why me? There are bigger firms, flashier names. He smiled faintly and said he did not want bigger or flashier. He wanted someone who understood what it meant to build from nothing, someone who had fire behind the designs. He said he had no interest in working with people who cared more about being safe than being true. I closed the folder carefully, my fingers brushing the heavy paper. The shame of being called a disgrace still echoed, but here was a man who saw the same story and called it courage. I realized then that the insult my father had hurled could become fuel. That evening, Back in my apartment, I signed the contract. My hands shook as I did it. Not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. I placed the signed pages back into the folder, sealing the moment with finality. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the corners of my mouth lifting despite myself. It was more than money. It was a validation I had never been given at home. Someone was willing to bet on me, not in spite of who I was, but because of it. I whispered into the quiet room, my voice steady. This time, they will see me. The lease papers lay on the counter in front of me, the ink still drying where I had signed my name. The office was nothing more than a converted loft above an old brick warehouse in the Boston Arts District. But to me, it felt like a cathedral. The tall windows let in streams of pale winter light, dust floating through the air like glitter. The walls were bare. The floor creaked in places, and the heating hissed unevenly from a radiator in the corner. It was imperfect, but it was mine. I walked slowly across the space, my footsteps echoing against the wood floors, and pictured what it could become. Desks lined along one wall, a long table in the center for sketches and brainstorming, whiteboards filled with color swatches, notes, wild ideas. I touched the wall near the window and whispered the name I had chosen, Brightline Studio. The name had come to me late one night as I scrolled through my portfolio. A bright line between the old life and the new. Between what my family said I could not do and what I was about to prove. The first week was chaotic. I hauled second-hand furniture up the narrow stairs by myself, pausing every few steps to catch my breath. I ordered a printer that nearly bankrupted me and spent 2 nights assembling IKEA desks until my hands ached. There was a moment, as I sat on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes, when doubt crept in. What if this space never became anything more than a vanity project? But the folder from Nextwave sat on the desk, the contract signed, and it reminded me I was already further than I had ever been before. I knew I could not do it alone. I put up a listing for an assistant designer, and within days I was sitting in a coffee shop interviewing applicants. Most were polite but unremarkable, showing portfolios filled with assignments that felt safe and predictable. Then Sophie walked in. She was 23, fresh out of art school, with unruly dark hair and a nervous energy that made her words tumble out quickly. She placed her sketchbook on the table, flipping through pages of ideas that were raw, imperfect, but alive. There were logos drawn in pencil with jagged edges, color palettes that clashed but somehow worked, notes scribbled in margins. I studied her work and then looked up at her. Why do you want this job? She hesitated, then said quietly, because no one has given me a chance yet. I think I could be good. If someone would just let me try. Her honesty pierced me. I offered her the position on the spot, her face lighting up with disbelief before she nodded fiercely. The next week, we moved into the office together. Sophie showed up with a backpack, a battered laptop, and enough enthusiasm to fill the empty space. We worked side by side at mismatched desks, our coats still on because the radiator struggled against the January chill. The first days of Nextwave consumed us. David wanted a new identity that would make them stand out in a crowded tech market. Something bold but approachable. We pinned sketches on the walls, scribbled notes in marker, tore them down, and started again. Nights blurred into mornings. We ordered pizza at midnight, the boxes piling up on the windowsill. Sophie sprawled on the floor with her laptop while I stood at the wall, drawing over old ideas with fresh strokes of marker. We argued, laughed, doubted, and then found sudden breakthroughs that left us both breathless. One night, after hours of false starts, Sophie tossed a paper aside and said, "What if we stopped thinking about them as a tech company and started thinking of them as a bridge?" The word hung in the air. I grabbed a marker and sketched a simple line, arcing upward, splitting into colors that fanned out. She jumped to her feet, shouting, "Yes! That's it! That's them!" From that moment, the brand came alive, bright colors, replacing sterile blues. A logo that suggested movement and connection. Messaging that spoke of people rather than products. We built slide decks, mocks websites, and even drafted billboard concepts. When we finally presented it to David, he leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he smiled. "This is exactly what I wanted," he said. "You captured who we are better than we could." The contract expanded. More deliverables added. More money flowing in than I had ever managed before. Sophie and I celebrated by buying cheap champagne and toasting with paper cups in the office, the bubbles fizzing over as we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Within a month, the new brand launched. Next Wave's unveiling made headlines in local business journals. Their new logo glowed on a billboard along I-93. The bright arc stretching across the sky. Articles praised the fresh direction, calling it bold, unexpected, a risk that paid off. And every piece of coverage mentioned Brightline Studio, the small new firm in the arts district that had made it happen. One morning, Sophie burst into the office holding a newspaper folded open. "Look," she said, pointing at the headline, "Local startup agency behind Next Wave's bold new look." The article included a photograph of me standing in front of one of our mock-ups, Sophie grinning beside me, my name printed in black ink. No longer dismissed, no longer hidden in the shadows. I sat at my desk with the papers spread out, my hand resting on the headline. The humiliation of Christmas was still etched in my memory, but it was fading against the glow of this moment. For the first time, Boston knew Brightline, and they knew me. The phone rang on my desk, Mark's name glowing on the screen. I hesitated before answering, already knowing what he was going to say. His voice was calm, careful, the same tone he had used since we were kids when he tried to smooth over Dad's anger. He told me he had seen the articles, that the studio's work looked great. But then he shifted, asking if I could consider lowering my voice. He said Dad was furious about the way things had played out, but that if I showed some humility, if I made an effort to make peace, Dad might be willing to forgive me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the sunlight spilling across the floorboards. My brother meant well, but his words carried the same old weight. Forgiveness was only offered if I bowed my head. If I admitted that I was wrong to follow my own path, I let him finish, his sentences looping back to the same plea. When he paused, I asked quietly, "What about me? Mark, when has anyone in this family ever considered forgiving themselves for not seeing me?" The line went silent for a beat. Then he sighed. "Dad just wants what is best." The words stung. What is best for him? Not for me. I could hear the discomfort in Mark's voice, the way he wanted to disagree, but could not. He murmured that he had to go, then promised to call again soon. 2 days later, my mother asked to meet. She suggested a quiet cafe in Brookline, a place far enough from our usual haunts that she would not risk running into friends. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting upright in a pale sweater, her hands wrapped around a teacup. Her eyes softened when she saw me, but her words were measured. She said Dad had been harsh, harsher than he meant to be, but that his only goal was to keep the family strong. She told me not to fight him, not to turn my back on all they had built. Her voice trembled when she added that she wanted me home for Easter, that she did not want to see the family divided further. I stirred my coffee slowly, listening, my chest tight. Then I told her the truth I had been carrying since childhood. It has never been about what is good for me. It has always been about what is good for him, for the company, for the image. Every time I tried to choose differently, I became the problem to fix. Her lips pressed together, her eyes flickering with hurt. For a long moment she did not answer. Finally, she reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "Just promise me you will think about it," she whispered. I nodded, not out of agreement, but out of weariness. That evening, I stopped by Aunt Carol's house. She opened the door with a smile that was both knowing and kind, ushering me into the warmth of her living room. The walls were lined with books and photographs of her work at the shelter. She poured us glasses of wine and asked about Brightline. I told her about Sophie, about the long nights, about the joy of seeing our work come alive. When I mentioned Mark's call and Mom's plea, her face tightened. She shook her head, setting her glass down firmly. Lauren, you do not need to shrink yourself to fit into their vision. You do not need to be forgiven for being who you are. Success is not one shape, and you are proving it every day. Her words settled into me like a balm. I had carried the weight of being outside the circle for so long that it felt strange to hear someone say I did not need to claw my way back in. Carol squeezed my hand and told me she had always known I would find my place, but that it would never be in their mold. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, the cold air clear against my skin, I felt something shift. The calls, the pleas, the half-hearted offers of forgiveness were not bridges. They were chains, tugging me toward the same narrow life. For the first time, I no longer felt tempted to reach for them. The distance between me and my family was widening. But instead of fear, I felt strength. I could still hear Dad's voice in my memory, sharp and certain, telling me I would regret my choices. But standing there in the glow of the street lamps, I knew that the only regret would have been never choosing myself. The summer sun of 2024 pressed hot against the windows of my parents' house in Newton when the family gathered to talk about the future. It was the kind of meeting that always felt more like a tribunal than a conversation. The dining table, polished and formal, was covered with folders, documents, and glasses of iced tea sweating in the heat. Mark sat beside Dad, leaning forward with quiet confidence, his wedding band glinting in the light. Mom arranged the papers with her usual precision, her pearls catching on the edge of her blouse. I took a seat at the far end, feeling more like a witness than a participant. The attorney, a family friend who had handled their affairs for decades, cleared his throat and explained that the Newton house, the summer property in Cape Cod, and the Mitchell Trust would all be passed along. His words were smooth, rehearsed, his tone calm. When he read out the division, my name was not mentioned once. All assets and properties would go to Mark. He was the sole successor, the custodian of the Mitchell legacy. My stomach tightened as though a stone had dropped into it. My hand curled into my lap as relatives around the table murmured approvingly. I heard a cousin whisper to another, "She brought this on herself." I caught an aunt shaking her head faintly, her eyes sliding toward me with something between pity and dismissal. Dad glanced down the table at me briefly, his jaw set. There was no explanation offered, no apology for my exclusion, only the unspoken message that I had made my choice when I walked away. I kept my face still, but inside, the wound dug deep. I thought of all the years I had eaten at that table, all the nights I had tried to prove myself worthy of even a sliver of acknowledgement, and now, when it came to the inheritance of our family's wealth and name, I was erased as if I had never been part of it at all. After the meeting, conversation drifted into lighter topics. As though the blow had not just landed, Mark presented Dad with a new watch, a gleaming piece from Switzerland, the price tag hidden but obvious. Mom clasped her hands in delight as Dad fastened it around his wrist. The relatives leaned in to admire, their voices full of praise. When it was my turn to offer a gift, I slid a carefully wrapped canvas across the table. It was a painting I had spent weeks on, a scene of the Charles River at sunset, the skyline glowing against the water. I had chosen it because Boston was our home, because I wanted to give them something of myself, something true. Mom peeled back the wrapping, revealing the colors, and smiled politely. Dad studied it for a moment, then set it aside without comment. The silence spoke louder than words. Around the table, relatives shifted, some offering half-hearted compliments, others ignoring it altogether. Compared to Mark's glittering gift, my painting looked like a child's attempt. I sat back, my cheeks warm but my expression calm. My eyes drifted to the watch gleaming on Dad's wrist, the faces of family leaning toward Mark as though he were the sun, and the rest of us only revolved around him. Inside, the silence turned sharp. I swallowed the bitterness, forcing myself not to speak, not to rise, not to let them see me break. But every heartbeat carried the same vow deeper into me. One day, the weight of their dismissal would tip. One day, the balance they had carefully crafted would not hold. I rose from the table quietly, excusing myself to the porch. The summer air was heavy, cicadas buzzing in the trees. I leaned against the railing, staring at the lawn I had run across as a child, back when I still thought home meant belonging. The voices from inside floated through the open window, laughter and approval wrapping around Mark like a crown. My painting rested on the sideboard, forgotten, the edges of the canvas catching the light. I tightened my grip on the railing until my knuckles ached. I said nothing. I did not storm back in, did not demand fairness, did not plead. But in that silence, a promise grew firm. Someday, they would see the difference between gifts bought with money and gifts built from the soul. Someday they would know what it meant to overlook me. I pushed off the railing, walking down the steps into the yard, the grass cool beneath my heels. Above me, the summer sky stretched wide, endless and bright. And for the first time, I felt the smallest spark of relief that their inheritance was not mine to carry. The call came late on a Tuesday evening. Months after that summer gathering, I was working late at Brightline, Sophie asleep on the couch after another marathon brainstorming session. My phone lit up with Mark's name. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. His voice was tight, strained in a way I had never heard from him. He told me Mitchell Construction had just lost one of their largest contracts, a multi-million-dollar project with a corporate client they had worked with for years. The reason, delivered bluntly by the client, was that the company's image looked old and uninspired. They said Mitchell Construction felt stuck in the past, that their marketing did not speak to the modern market. I sat back in my chair, the words heavy in the quiet office. My mind flickered to the countless times Dad had called my work a hobby, dismissed my designs as childish. Now the very thing he had refused to see was the reason the empire was crumbling. Mark spoke quickly, his sentences tumbling over each other. He said employees were nervous, morale was slipping, and several younger managers were openly frustrated. He said investors were asking why the company had not modernized. And behind it all, Dad was furious, pacing through the offices like a storm, blaming everyone except himself. I could picture the scene vividly. The same office where I had once been offered a role on his terms. Now the walls must have felt smaller, the awards on the shelves less reassuring. Mark said they had held an emergency board meeting. The discussion grew heated, older executives clinging to tradition while younger ones demanded change. Someone mentioned rebranding, the word tasting foreign in that space. Dad exploded at the suggestion, insisting Mitchell Construction had survived decades without gimmicks. But the truth was obvious. The world had shifted, and they had not. I could hear exhaustion in Mark's voice as he described the meeting. Dad slammed his fist on the table, his face red, his voice echoing through the room. He insisted the problem was temporary, that clients would return once they remembered Mitchell Construction's reputation. But the board members pressed harder. A reputation meant nothing if it no longer spoke to the times. Finally, Mark admitted what no one else dared say. Maybe it was time to look outside. Maybe it was time to consider bringing in help. There was a long silence in the boardroom after his words. He told me. Dad glared at him as though he had betrayed him. But the other directors shifted uncomfortably, acknowledging the truth in Mark's suggestion. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was low, clipped. Help from who? And Mark, steady but hesitant, said softly, maybe we need Lauren. I froze in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear. Sophie stirring on the couch behind me. My name had been spoken in that boardroom, in the one place I had always been unwelcome. Mark rushed to add that it was only a suggestion, that Dad had not agreed, that the room had split into arguments again. Some said it was unthinkable. Others said it might be the only way forward. I could almost hear Dad's rage. Could imagine the flush rising on his face. The memory of Christmas, of me standing in defiance, fresh in his mind. For him to admit he needed me would be the deepest wound to his pride. Yet the irony was sharp. The same man who had called me a disgrace now stood in the ruins of his own arrogance, forced to consider the value of what he had dismissed. Mark's voice cracked slightly as he told me he was sorry for dragging me into it. But he wanted me to know the truth. Things were falling apart. Dad might not admit it yet, but the company needed me. I let his words settle. The silence stretching between us, I did not answer. Not right away. My heart was pounding with a mix of anger, vindication, and something dangerously close to satisfaction. Through the window, the city lights blinked against the night sky, steady and alive. I thought of the name on my own office door. Brightline Studio. The clients who had trusted me, the campaigns that had worked. And now, the very empire that had rejected me was faltering, brought low by the absence of the vision they had once scorned. Mark exhaled heavily. Filling the silence, he said Dad was fighting it with everything he had. But the board was restless. The pressure mounting. Then, almost in a whisper, he added, "They are going to come to you, Lauren. It is only a matter of time." The call came on a gray Monday morning in September. I was in the middle of reviewing concepts with Sophie when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. But something made me swipe to answer. It was my father. His voice was clipped, formal, as if he were speaking to a stranger. He said we needed to meet, and not at the family home. He suggested the offices of Warner and Blake, the law firm that had handled Mitchell Construction's contracts for decades. When I arrived, the receptionist led me to a conference room lined with heavy bookshelves and a long glass table. My father was already seated at the far end. His suit pressed, his tie knotted perfectly, but his shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. He did not rise when I entered, only gestured for me to sit. The air was thick with pride and tension. He started by saying the company was fine, that they were managing, that the situation was not as dire as the press had painted. His tone was almost dismissive. A performance of strength? I listened silently, waiting for him to say why he had really called me here. Eventually, his words faltered. He admitted that 2 more clients had pulled contracts in the past week. One of them, a developer in Cambridge, had told him directly that Mitchell Construction looked like a relic of the past, unable to connect with younger investors. I saw the crack in his composure when he repeated that line, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting away from mine. For a moment, the silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken fights. Then he said what I never thought I would hear. "We need help." I folded my hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "If you want Brightline to take this on, it will be as a client. This is not a favor, and it is not an apology wrapped as a contract. My team will run this project the same way we run any other, and you will respect that." His eyes flashed with something between resentment and resignation. He started to argue, saying he had decades of experience, that no one knew the Mitchell name better than he did. I held his gaze and reminded him that the Mitchell name was exactly what was driving clients away. He sat back, his knuckles white on the armrests of his chair. For a moment, I thought he might stand and walk out, but then the attorney entered with a folder of documents, sliding them across the table toward him. The proposed contract lay open, the figure clear, the timeline firm. My father stared at the papers for a long time before picking up the pen. He signed with a stiff hand, each stroke of his signature seeming to cost him something. When he finished, he pushed the folder toward me. "Fine," he said. "But this is business." "Yes," I replied evenly. "Business." The first months were grueling. Sophie and I threw ourselves into research, dissecting every piece of Mitchell Construction's public image. Their brochures looked like they had been printed in the 1992nd. Their website was clunky, filled with jargon that meant little to modern investors. Their logo was a block of gray, lifeless and dated. We stripped it all down and rebuilt. New visuals that felt strong but fresh. Messaging that spoke to innovation while honoring heritage. Campaigns that told stories of impact, of families and communities. Not just concrete and steel. The office in the Arts District became our war room. sketches covering every inch of the wall, pizza boxes piling in corners, late nights stretching into dawn. At first, Dad resisted. He questioned every draft, every color choice, every line of text. He sent sharp emails full of edits, his pride bleeding into every critique. But then the numbers began to shift. Inquiries increased. The new website launched. And within a month, their leads grew by a third. Investors started calling again. At the 6-month mark, Mitchell Construction had not only stopped the bleeding but had gained 35% more clients than before. Their name appeared in trade journals as an example of successful adaptation. And every article credited Brightline Studio. One afternoon, after reviewing the quarterly report, my father called me into his office. His desk, usually cluttered with blueprints and contracts, was clear except for the report and a single pen. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, the words came. "You saved this company." The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. I stood there, absorbing the weight of what he had admitted. It was not an apology for Christmas. It was not a reconciliation of all the years, but it was something undeniable. Something he had never given me before. Acknowledgement. I nodded once. "Steady, this was never about saving your company," I said. "It was about doing the work right." He looked down at the report again, his mouth tightening, but he did not argue. When I left his office, the halls of Mitchell Construction felt different. The portraits of past projects still hung on the walls. But now, in small ways, they also carried my imprint. For the first time, I walked through those halls, not as a daughter dismissed, but as a professional whose work had left its mark. Christmas of 2025 arrived with fresh snow on the lawns of Newton. The lights strung across my parents' house glowing against the winter sky. I walked up the path with a steady breath, my boots crunching softly, my coat wrapped close. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the air, the sound of laughter spilling into the foyer as I stepped through the door. The house was full. Just like always, cousins lined the living room. Children played near the tree. And relatives I had not seen in months filled every chair. But this year felt different. There was no edge of pity in their glances, no whispers as I entered. Instead, several faces turned toward me with smiles that seemed almost cautious, as though they were seeing me for the first time. Mom moved quickly through the crowd and embraced me, her hands trembling slightly as they pressed into my back. She whispered that she was glad I was there, her eyes damp when she pulled away. I nodded, the warmth of her gesture sinking in, though the distance of years could not be erased with a single moment. At the dining table, I found my seat beside Aunt Carol, who squeezed my hand with her familiar firmness. She looked at me with quiet pride, her smile saying more than any words could. Across the table, Mark lifted his glass in a small acknowledgement, his expression calm but tight. Patricia touched his arm, murmuring something I could not hear. Dinner unfolded with the usual rhythm of holiday meals. Plates of stuffing and mashed potatoes passed from hand to hand, glasses refilled with wine and cider. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose, and the glow of the candles softened the room. I ate quietly, listening, waiting. When the plates were cleared and dessert was set out, my father rose from his chair. The room hushed, every eye turning toward him. He stood tall, though age had crept into his frame, and his hand gripped his glass firmly. He began by thanking everyone for being there, for another year of family gathered around the same table,